Gentlemen, can I warn you of one thing, please? I'm not a movie maker, but I've seen a lot of movies of me. And what happens very frequently is the camera is put in front of me, and it stays there unto eternity. Nobody moves it around, shifts angles, does anything. And the result is that people become bored merely by this one vision of this mouth talking, you see. So I beg you, if you can, if it is convenient, to make it more dynamic by moving the camera, make close ups, or whatever you.
You're a director now.
I'm not directing,
That's
I'm
good.
telling you my experience with movie
No, no,
making.
no. We like participatory movie making. That's very true.
Well,
But you
this.
know something? Something else that we've learned is that
He
sometimes
wants you
the most compelling
to go
speaker
in and out, move the camera a little bit during the interview.
can be, when you get to the edit room, totally boring. There's something about the medium and the relationship of the camera to the person that provides another variable. And sometimes the person you think when you're talking to is very boring appears the opposite. We have experience with you, so we're confident.
It's not
that
how
you're-
you're shot. It's whether they intercut the interview with other footage. It's really more of an editorial question rather than a production question.
But there is a problem of trying to get a thought through. And you have to do that in order to. You have to have a sustained discussion. In other words, you can cut and you may get the ideas in scattered through a movie that has a good deal of many other ideas, okay?
Right.
But I'll tell you frankly, when you do that, you're deceiving yourself and often the audience unknowingly because the way I talk is what I would call dialectical. I draw one idea out of another. I'm inductive rather than deductive. That is to say, I'm rather on the organic side. And so to understand what I'm trying to say is to sustain a thread of ideas and watch it grow. And that would be a problem, you see. When you cut too much, the main idea and the main thrust is
No,
lost.
I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. But you know what? Let's. I just want to proceed on the basis of let's plant the seed and then let it grow. But the one thing that you said before, which I found interesting, is this question of anarchism perceived as being a kind of infantile philosophy that appeals to the impulses of adolescents who want to rebel and who basically adopt all the trappings of anarchism. The black clothing and the circle, the A in the circle. And well, let's talk about that.
The first one to say that, by the way, I think was Clemenceau. He said, "You've never been young if you weren't an anarchist sometime in your life." It's a loose quotation. I mean, I'm not giving you an exact, you know, quote. And there's another feature too, and that is a very important feature, and that is that anarchists have not defined themselves. The word anti authoritarian typically is negative. It's not a definition in positive terms, you see. So, consequently, one doesn't so much hold a vision of what a new society should be like, and even discuss and quarrel, which is quite healthy, over that vision or various competing visions. One makes competing visions an end in itself. The result is that you cannot appeal to any large number of people. It becomes esoteric. It becomes a subtle doctrine, you see, and it suffers sometimes from a degree of subtlety that makes it completely incoherent. And let me say, too, and this is important, which had a profound effect upon my experience with anarchists, not just a question of our ideas, and that is the fact that anarchists value this incoherence. They make that a fetish. They value it. and that finds itself expressed in many different ways, not only in ideas, but even in procedure and even in organization. The idea is the more coherent you are, the more authoritarian you are. This is an absurdity because we're not only, if, let me put it more precisely, if we were looking for a common idea, okay, tried to fetishize incoherence, we'd be working against rationality. Science predicates itself on coherence. The debate within science or between scientists in the same field is the idea to unify reality, to find what its common denominators are, to find what its uh, sensibility and susceptibility to a unity, to a coherent and meaningful world is. And this is the highest form of morality. The highest form of morality. To make a fetish out of the idea that you are incomprehensible or that your theories are incomprehensible is to actually subvert the possibility of creating a movement and building yourself on a form of individualism. That's where the real individualism that anarchists have been accused of comes into play. The idea, above all, that you should not be comprehensible. And that is an abdication, a total abdication of the idea that you should build a movement. From this came the terrorist drift in anarchism, the idea of the heroic individual who would change the world. And you know, if you want to really look at it, it's a very elitist point of view. A very elitist point of view that there are the appointed, those who are elected by what you can decide, who will make the changes that really should be made by the masses of people in motion. The real revolutionary ideal of the people making the changes rather than the heroic individual, whether it be an Alexander the Great, to take the preposterous point of view, whether it be other great assassins, so to speak, who've gone into history that way. These points of view, in point of fact, are actually very elitist as well. So that the dialectic between the masses in motion and the heroic, the hero in history, are two competing notions that have totally dissolved the unity of anarchism. That leads to another point which I would rather take up later, the question of syndicalism in competition with anarchism.
Okay, I'm not going to do this often, but I'm just going to throw this out as a starting point for you to sort of like, take the ball and dribble it down court. And that is, the last major interview we did with you was sometime around 1980. And you were very specific in calling yourself and defining yourself as an anarchist and basically talked about how you became an anarchist. So now we're here with you roughly 24 years later. And, we just want to start this discussion on the intervening 24 years and where you've progressed to in your thinking.
Well, I took what was generally regarded as the popular image of anarchism, not the terrorist, that idiotic notion of anarchy as being bomb throwing and the rest. I took the more sophisticated image of anarchy, namely anti-authoritarianism, a word I'm sure you've heard repeatedly, the formation of new movements in particular that drew from the entire socialist, or if you like, communist tradition, and tried to see what they had in common and how they melded together to create a unified movement. That was important. The most important thing is what that movement stood for, not simply what that movement was against. It was easy enough to find people who would insist and agree with me, as they agreed with each other, I'm quite sure, that you had that capitalism was irrational, minimally that it was irrational. It was an irrational social order. And that you had to bring rationality to a social order that sought the public good, tried to maximize, if I may use a term that I don't particularly like, but tried to maximize the possibilities of ever-emerging developments in technology, ever-emerging developments in insight into the natural world, insight into the relationship of people to each other, and unify that into a coherent body of ideas. That, I assumed, was the one image I could work with in anarchism. I couldn't do that in the communist movement, and I would not call it communism, but exactly the communist or Stalinist movement. That was closed. The door was closed on that issue with the emergence of the Bolsheviks. And with that, also the betrayals of the Social Democrats, who in turn closed the door, so far as I was concerned, on conventional Marxism. And I want to distinguish here very plainly between Karl Marx's writing and development. He changed his point of view very radically, from the early part of his life to its middle part and to the latter part of Marxian ideas. The changes were incredible. Most people are not cognizant of them. It's only now that we have, in English, I point to the 40 volumes of Marx's collected works, that we have access to points of view that Marx never expressed in the conventional format that Stalinism gave it. So I had neither social democracy, Marxism, and therefore I was left with only one thing, a conventional, but at least sophisticated, anti-authoritarian, and more importantly, utopian vision of a rational society. And that rationality was totally closed to me by the development of capitalism, which turned out to be the account, the history in a sense, of a movement that always turned anything that could have served the public good into a worse evil. Most decisively, the uses of technology. There, everything from a penknife to a nuclear reactor is designed in one way or another to do some harm, and is used most effectively for sinister and frankly evil purposes. But what I was doing, unbeknownst to me, was not working with the mergers that had taken place in all these different social movements. Karl Marx was not simply an authoritarian. He was also, in his own way, a libertarian. And books have been written demonstrating that fact very, very effectively. And one has to account for how these relationships interacted with each other in Marx's own mind and in the movements that Marx participated and to some extent even founded, like the First International. It must be remembered that the inaugural address of the First International, one of the most libertarian statements written and promulgated by a mass movement, the International Workingmen's Association, which we now call the First International. That inaugural address, which says that only the working class can liberate itself, that famous line, which has appeared on endless anarchist periodicals, was written by guess who? Karl Marx. And these things have to be squared off, and their relationship historically and theoretically have to be clearly defined. But they never were, not to my satisfaction anyway. So the point is that when I met you, I was looking for something that would spring the trap, that conventional versions of Marxism, of communism, of anarchism had created for me. And I would exclude anarchism at that time because anarchism was so ill-defined that anything you wanted to believe would be as acceptable as anything else. It made no difference. And as I said, this, at least for the anarchists, was deliberate, whereas for all the other movements, it was not. It was due to the unintended consequences of fights within the movements themselves. What I was giving you in point of fact, or trying to present to people who were reading my works, was a version of a libertarian movement that approximated syndicalism. When Joe Hill famously wrote his parting statement to all, before he was going to be shot by a Utah Wasat firing squad, said, "Don't mourn, organize," this would have offended thousands of anarchists. It was exactly not to organize, but to think of a revolution emerging completely spontaneously, that people who called themselves anarchists believed in. Yet it was accepted, as things will be accepted. Don't mourn, organize was a syndicalist statement if it was anti-authoritarian in its premises. That's not what the anarchists believed in. And many anarchists, most famously Malatesta, condemned syndicalism when it was being presented in the 1890s and early 1900s for being authoritarian, for being, quote, dogmatic because it was systematic, relatively speaking. Condemned these movements. And that fight never ended. It never ended. So I didn't realize, first of all, the nature of the fight and what was at its root. And I gradually assimilated more and more a deeper understanding, at least as I thought, of anarchism when in the book that I wrote not too long ago, Social Anarchism or Lifestyle Anarchism, in which I emphasized, as a result of my studies of postmodernism, get this straight, this is the joke, as a result of my studies of postmodernism, that anarchism was a lifestyle. It was primarily a lifestyle. And I had been imputing, when I talked about organization to it, when I talked about organization and the importance of building movements, and the anarchists were opposed to mass movements, incidentally, I didn't realize that I was mouthing, basically, certain syndicalist notions which were antithetical to anarchism. Anarchism was an individual philosophy, and it had its roots, quite understandably, in Max Stirner. And not surprisingly, Stirner has been adopted by every point of view you can think of, pretty nearly, including certain fascists. But it was an individualistic tendency. Syndicalism emphasized the autonomy of the individual, and that word autonomy was more important in syndicalism than words like freedom. Freedom, in fact, was identified with individual autonomy, and nothing was more antithetical to the syndicalists than the idea that they should that they should reduce their movement to mainly individual autonomy, which is what the anarchists were trying to do. This fight went on in Spain very markedly in the public view when there were fights between, oh, what's her name again? One of my favorite hates. Come now, my friends, you have to help an 80.
My tongue. What's her name? No. I remember when I was with Maria. She was still alive when we were in Spain. She was protected by all this Senate stalwarts.
She was the minister of health. She was the minister of health in the Republican government during the Civil War.
No, the anarchist. You know what? See, we're all showing signs of age here. I can't remember, and it's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway.
In any case, she was a syndicalist, as was her father. Orales was the family name. Urales. And she became the minister in the Republican government during the Civil War when the anarchists, so-called anarchists, entered the government. Okay? Which gives you some idea of the waywardness of her views and the inconsistency of her views. So it was characteristic, really, that she never gave up that individualistic point of view. And she published a periodical with her father, which was even permitted to exist under the dictatorship in the 1920s. Okay? She published an individualistic periodical which was permitted to exist while most of the syndicalist periodicals were either suppressed or essentially forced out of existence, if not by coercion, then by, shall we say, the general atmosphere of fear that prevailed in Spain in the 1920s. So that fight was never given up. It was never surrendered. It was always a cause of differences in the Federación Anarquista Ibérica, the famous FAI, Iberian Anarchist Federation, which never claimed by any standard or by any statistical attempt to evaluate its membership to number more than about 30,000 people. In contrast to the anarcho-syndicalist trade union mass organization, an organization that was not committed to affinity groups, an organization that was based on a trade union structure. Remember that there were two organizations in Spain, the FAI and the CNT, and when they were both put on the same banner, there was a mutual betrayal of their positions because they had very much that was not in common. Please bear that in mind. It dawned upon me as time went by, and particularly as I observed the development of the so-called anarchist movement in the United States and in Europe, the trend toward individualism, the trend toward postmodernism, which in my opinion, frankly, is another form of nihilism. I find the only thing the postmodernists really have in common is nihilism. They have much in common, by the way, with Nietzsche as well. And it's not surprising that Emma Goldman viewed Nietzsche, I almost quote her, as an anarchist. These things were, from my point of view, impermissible and prohibited the development of a mass movement, and a movement, in fact, not just scattered affinity groups and then confederated, borrowing confederation from the the syndicalists. The mischief was in large part caused by Proudhon, theoretically speaking. He is, in a sense, to the extent that you can speak of an architect, the man who structured the idea of something resembling syndicalism, although by no means is he the father of syndicalism. He was the man who structured the idea of confederations. And once he did that, he essentially betrayed, whether knowingly or unknowingly, the most important feature of what I would truly call anarchism, and that was autonomy, a word I rarely use in my writings. Please note that well. And I use it almost purely for grammatical purposes rather than for theoretical purposes. Individual autonomy has always been to me an issue of no consequence, because I would say that if you had a truly libertarian society, you would have the right kind of autonomy. Remember, there are kinds of autonomy that range from the Führer principle in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascism. Ideas of autonomy, in this case the Führer principle, through the anarcho-syndicalist view that you somehow try to mix autonomy with sociality, and a real confederation based on a non-authoritarian viewpoint. Now, these were fundamental things for me, because I began to see that anarchists, or those I was encountering in increasing number in the United States, use the word anarchism for the most promiscuously wild, often senseless and irrational views. Most important to me was the opposite of what many of these anarchists meant, and that was community in the civic sense. I don't mean community between people, community in the same household. I mean community as a mode of social organization. I counterposed community to the nation state. I hope this makes sense. And I began to find that there was a word, and there even was a man whose works I have not read, Le Français, who, according to Kropotkin in his memoirs, made the statement, "Thank you, friends, but I'm a communalist, not an anarchist." This was during the Paris Commune in 1871 in France. Thank you, friends. He was anti-authoritarian, that was clear, but he was a communalist. He used that very word. Not communist, but communalist, based on the principle of a body politic, using the word using the word politic in its Greek sense, the polis, humanly scaled, confederated, and structured to cultivate differences, but do so within an organized, and this is the important word, institutionalized framework. The question for me was, what kind of institutions would exist under the libertarian society that I envisioned? What type of institutions? So let me just briefly summarize what my differences were as they began to develop since I saw you last. First of all was the idea, the recognition, that society was built around institutions, in contrast to the supposedly anarchist cry make war on institutions, not on men. This is a famous Spanish anarchist slogan. Make war on institutions. No, I did not want to make war on institutions. I wanted institutions to be created in a libertarian way and confederated, well-structured, and well-defined. Another one, and I'm summarizing them almost in terms of anarchist slogans. No law. Indeed, the only law anything resembling law that regulated human behavior in Bakunin's world was supposed to be custom. Custom was the word that Bakunin used as a substitute for what we would call law. And I found custom to be an extremely regressive point of view. A very regressive point of view, because custom is unthinking. Custom is what you take. My father was, as a matter of tradition. The famous statement in America, my father was a Democrat, therefore I'm a Democrat. Or, I'm Jewish because my family was Jewish. I'm a Christian, I'm a Methodist, or whatever it was. An unthinking assimilation of formations of I'm looking for the appropriate word because we don't have a libertarian language in a very, very real sense. Custom in the sense that it's like instinct. We don't think about it. We are impelled to act upon it for reasons that we often can't explain. To me, law was the highest form of reflective structuring, of reflective organization. This is where mind had to be brought into the picture. Indeed, everything that we would call rational had to challenge the way we proceeded, the way we acted. What I was seeking was a rational society, not a customary society. And the more precise law could be, the more vulnerable was it to challenge by the masses, because then we knew exactly what was being asked of us by a law and what we should accept and what we should reject, or what we should ourselves formulate. And very importantly were the institutions that had to be created. This is where the real debate was to be centered. What kind of institutions are you debating? Something like the Greek polis, which to the degree that society had developed in the ancient world was capable of freedom only to the extent that it met in face-to-face democratic relationships. I was in fact shocked, and I'll never forget the time when I got into arguments with old-time anarchists about the question of law and the state. And I was shocked to learn that they did not believe in law at all. They did not believe in constrained, clearly formulated and defined forms of behavior. How we would behave and how we would organize the society, whether rationally or irrationally, whether we would do so on the basis of clear definitions that were challengeable, and finally, to do so in a direct democracy, were to me the criteria for determining whether or not social organization was irrational or non-rational or rational. So my attitude toward politics began to change. I felt it was necessary to create a body politic in the sense that the Greeks had done. However limited, in my view, given our time, of course, we're thousands of years away from the Greek polis, but even to the extent that it exists in the town meeting in America, and to the extent that it existed in assemblies of the people and confederations of town meetings, as it existed in New England. These were real, experienced, institutional modes of behavior. They were not simply fantasies. They were not simply daydreams. They occurred in every revolution. And the main job of counter-revolution was to disassemble these structures, these criteria, these forms of organization. So I had run a whole gamut of views from this particular standpoint. I questioned the anarchist, and that would be anarchist, attitude toward law. I questioned the ability to run society simply on the basis of individual autonomy as distinguished from democratic voting, which the anarchists opposed, demanding if there were to be any form of organization, it had to be non-democratic. It had to be consensual. That's the word I'm looking for. And how far this goes is difficult very frequently to convey. Consensus mutes dissonance. Consensus is a way of trying to force people to be free, to use Rousseau's famous remark. It was the highest form of coercion from the standpoint of decision-making. It was the highest form of coercion in the name of freedom. It was a contradiction in terms. Minorities and consensual organization and the right to form factions and the right to dispute and to organize around issues in opposition from one point of view to another. And I'm working with very difficult ideas here. The right to have this was the only way in which you could produce a creative body politic, because it is invariably, or almost invariably, the fact that by dispute, by the absence of consensus, by an attempt to cultivate minorities and to let them function freely as minorities in an organized way is the only way that we could produce a creative society. We had to be able to create, and to be able to create, we had to cultivate the minorities that come out often with the most advanced points of view, and far from forcing consensus, as I saw occur in the Clamshell Alliance, where an attempt was made to force people either to stand aside and not demand the adoption of their point of view, was a form of tyranny. Literally tyranny. One woman was even accused of being a police spy, and I knew her, of being a police spy at the second Clamshell Alliance in New Hampshire meeting. It was an assembly of the Clamshell Alliance branches or affinity groups or whatever they tended to call themselves. And was accused of being a police spy because she wouldn't stand aside, and thereby demanded the right, if there was going to be consensus, to have her point of view presented, debated, discussed, and retained by her in opposition to the rest of the group.
Let me just bring up this issue, because you know we're talking about truly liberatory institutions, and we're talking about this very real concept of the law, and how easily disposable that term was by anarchists. My my question is, to play devil's advocate in a truly liberatory institution, in a truly participatory direct democracy, you still have this kind of implicit threat that if there is direct democracy, you have a small number of individuals who really oppose the outcome of a direct democratic vote, let's say, to use another term. What means do you have of enforcement? Because having a law implies that there's an enforcement apparatus, which, an anarchist will say is coercion.
You have the right to debate repeatedly. And this is where we can have very serious disputes, but still they're valid and worth discussing. You can require that if you remain in the organization, you follow its procedure in the direct democracy by a majority vote, okay? Even though you disagree. But you have the right to state your disagreement at every point, at every feasible point in the progress of the organization. That's one. So you have not centralism, but you have democracy in the true sense that while you obey the law, you have a right to dispute it. You can't be forced to agree with it. You can't be forced to comply with it. A second choice, which I personally would want, would be the right to not to participate in a given action, decision, okay, while remaining a member of the organization and disputing or presenting and emphasizing your point of view. So one is to participate in a given action, in a given scheme of behavior, but disputing that form of behavior wherever feasible. That's one. The second one is to comply with that form of behavior but disputing it. Now, these two alternatives are perfectly feasible, and they have both been used in working organizations that I participated in.
Do we take a leap of faith then?
What?
A leap of faith in this sense. Do we assume, as Kropotkin did, that individuals left to their own devices will be mutually cooperative? Is that what we're basing this argument on?
I would not rely on that point of view at all. I would not rely on that point of view at all. What else can I say is historical examples have shown it over and over again that it's a failed point of view. And Kropotkin's only answer could have been that we haven't had the ideal society yet. But I don't know how ideal that society is. I don't know how practicable it would be. If it could happen, that would be nice. Then, to use an old Marxist-Leninist term, the state would wither away. I'm being sardonic now. I don't believe in the state as we define it, as anarchists have defined it up to now. But that's a separate question. It's a question of a theory of the state, because the state has been a very variable phenomenon. There are times when the state has been emancipatory. There are times when the state has been a reactionary, regressive, and constraining, authoritarian in the worst sense of the word, such as fascism. But there have been cases where even the state has played a progressive role in history. I'm not saying now. In history, the state emancipated males from the tyranny of patriarchy, precisely because the state needed freewheeling individuals who could work for it, who could defend it, who could satisfy its needs, many of which were as progressive as many were reactionary. and those were matters of judgment that had to be settled rationally, because there's no iron rule about these things. But there were cases where the state played a progressive role in emancipating men from patriarchs. The traditional domestic society, particularly among nomadic people, from an anthropological point of view, that domestic society was based on the old man. Now, Freud, of course, used that up to the hilt, as we know. But it did exist. Patriarchy does exist. Age divisions do exist. Sex divisions do exist. And there were times when the state, instead of enforcing these divisions, which were customary, note well, which were customary, why young men could be killed by their fathers without any retribution to their fathers, okay, was a custom, and people did it because it was done, so to speak, and that was it. But remember there that the state broke the hold of the fathers on the sons and could play a role in breaking, depending upon the degree, the hold of males on females. Remember well, based on custom, these holds could not be broken. These grips could not be broken. On the other hand, the state has played an atrocious role in regulating property and controlling or facilitating the development of private property, in forming armies that were imperialistic or developing imperialistic designs, we know that, in defending ruling classes traditionally, that we know. So we have to remember that there have been states and states and states. And while I'm not trying to dissolve the problematical nature of the state, I am trying to emphasize that the word state has to be nuanced.
Well, that's exactly a point. I think in trying to define where you've arrived to, as opposed to from where you started from, I'm hearing certain things. And one thing I'm hearing in this kind of nuanced version of the state being positive and negative, am I hearing that in areas where the state is proving to be progressive, is that a supportable position for, let's say, people like us to pursue? That's apart from trying to get to whatever end result, the liberatory institutional position. Is that something? Because many anarchists will totally, no, we can't do that. Nobody.
I know that.
Nobody for president. That kind of thing.
That's nonsense. Not because somebody should be president, but the idea that nobody should have any role that could in any way be coercive. And that, I think, is an attempt to create a black and white situation which has produced endless difficulties. If it had been possible to stop Hitler through a political party that was at least democratic or Republican in the conventional sense, I would have voted decisively in 1933 if I were in Germany for such a party. What were the consequences in not producing and not participating in or not preparing for politically Hitler, who cleverly decided that his main job was to disrupt the state and ultimately dissolve parliamentarism in the Führer principle. You know, he did that, basically. He made a decision, and so did the NSDAP, that is the Nazis, make the decision to participate in the parliamentary process because they saw they were not getting anywhere. They were engaged in street fights the way the Stalinists were. And that both of them tried to delegitimate parliamentary democracy such as it existed in Weimar Germany. But it was essential for them to delegitimize it, and particularly for the Nazis to delegitimize it, particularly when they were reaching close to 35% of the vote. Remember, that never did a socialist party in Germany receive a sufficient majority of the vote to create an all-social democratic government. It says a lot about the proletariat here, the workers' parties, you know. You can see where all these roads lead to. But there came a point where parliamentary democracy, in opposition to fascism, posed the basic question of whether or not we were going to produce barbarism. You see? And these alternatives have repeatedly torn extremely radical movements apart because of their lack of any kind of realism, their black and white picture, unmediated point of view. But I favor the abolition of the state. Let me make this clear. My goal is a federal polis, confederated polis, based on direct democracy, the town meeting, and of course a classless society. But I'm talking now about how to get there and what institutions we can use that are normally attributed to the state but which are not necessarily statist, such as town meetings, such as confederations of town meetings, such as forms of dual power, which can, in a sense, compete with the state and try to create a libertarian political structure.
Is that a practical suggestion? We talked about trying to create a true counterculture in every sense of the word, here and now, talking about going in that direction of really creating an alternative culture in every sense. Is that what we're saying?
Yes. I'm talking of town meetings even coexisting with a Republican government and competing with it for power. But under no circumstances can it compete with power unless it tests the will of the majority of the people. The question is whether or not a common will can be formed in a class society. That is the real question. If I'm talking about town meetings competing with City Hall here in Burlington, and we try to do that with our so-called green organization in Burlington, we had this experience. If I'm talking about confederations of these town meetings competing with the state government in Montpelier, and if we can attract the majority support, then we have the right to replace the existing state organization.
That seems like a practical suggestion. I mean, theoretically so. I mean, in Vermont, Vermont has always had this tradition. People flocked to Vermont in the 70s, all our generation, because they thought that Vermont was a place you could actually try to implement some kind of true participatory experience.
They didn't work the town meetings.
It didn't work, yeah, of course it did.
They left the town meetings alone because they regarded the town meetings as statist, and they were the very opposite of the state.
Well, let's say that is a suggestion that could conceivably be acted on in Vermont. But Vermont is a very unique for any other description, as opposed to, let's say, a Pennsylvania, as opposed to a Montana, as opposed to a California. I'm just trying to bring realism into this equation to some degree.
Realism. The Vermont, not just Vermont, the New England, believe me, Massachusetts had quite a system there too. They had statewide confederations of town meetings. That's why I explored this in the Third Revolution. That whole New England tradition swept all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. until Savannah, Georgia was won by town meetings. It was when the British came in and forced the revolutionary government to retreat. The point is, those ancestral Americans, if you want to call them that, could do it, did it, and why can't they do it again? The socialists, anarchists, communalists do not work with ideas that are not achievable at a given time. You have to work with the idea. There's a point where reality has to follow the idea. That is the function of a revolutionary movement. I'm quoting Marx here, by the way. You may not know this. That not only must the idea follow reality, your point of view as you express it now. I know I'm not saying you believe that. I know that. But the thesis that you've advanced here for me to consider. But Marx has also said not only must reality, not only must the idea follow reality, that is to say you have to be materialist, blah, 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 you have to be pragmatic, but also reality must follow the idea. Now you can juggle this dialectical interaction as much as you want, but the reality has shown that it has followed the idea. It did so under Pericles. Naturally, you will understandably have a feminist say that women were oppressed, that there was slavery in Greece, as though I don't know this, you know, after a very extensive study of the Greek political structure, and particularly the Periclean system, and that there have been all kinds of that Athens has been militaristic. It was. Why? Because all its citizens had to replace the army for fear of a professional military. And by the way, in the Vermont Constitution, the so-called Second Amendment, which entitles people in the federal Constitution to bear arms, or to, is stated very differently. There's a clause which says a professional military being a danger to liberty. This is not the national constitution, it's the Vermont Constitution. A professional military being a danger to liberty, nothing shall be done to prevent, and now I'm more or less giving you my words. When I said a professional military being a danger to liberty, I was quoting literally that Constitution, which I did a very careful study of, which I know no lefty to have done a damn thing about. Professional military being a danger to liberty, nothing shall be done to prevent the citizens of Vermont from blah, 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 from bearing arms. But notice the reason that is given. The reason that is given is on a higher theoretical level than what I see in the left today. In fact, the left today is for arms control. That keep guns out of the streets. Give it only to cops. Do the British thing, which is to disarm everybody, including the police, by the way, with what?
You disagree with that?
I disagree flatly with that. I oppose arms control today. I have no idea how radical the Vermont Constitution is. And I wrote a pamphlet on it. Senator Leahy sent me a gold-embossed letter saying that he welcomes this. This is a wonderful pamphlet, and he's put it up. You see, the senators all have cabinets in which they have examples, books, artworks, whatever, where they show the achievement of their state. And he's taken my pamphlet and put it up there, and
You should be honored.
and Madeline Kunin, when she became governor of the state, invited me to invited me to accept the status of an honorary Vermonter, and to come to a meal where all honorary Vermonters, all the literati and political thinkers were. I told her I couldn't go for the political reasons that I gave.
Well, so let's get back to the to this issue, which I think is an issue among, at least among anarchists, has caused a bit of controversy, and that is this issue of definition.
Yes, it's very important that you do
Is
that.
Murray an anarchist? Is Murray throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Is there no value in maintaining this kind of lineage, this defined anarchist lineage?
I'll be frank, very frank with you. I'm finding myself thrown into opposition with anarchists who don't understand anything of what I told you right now. They hear the word law, and the assumption immediately is that I'm a statist. You can't be either one or the other, you know what I mean? You're either anti-state, which gives you free license, and frankly leads to nihilism when you start exploring it, or else you're an anarchist, in which case you're the best of all human beings, although I've never found, aside from the Stalinist movement, more contemptible people. That is my personal experience. Particularly that magazine, Anarchy. I find that magazine, I wouldn't want to be associated with anything that calls itself Anarchy in the view of what that periodical produces. I mean, a man has gone around and he's been permitted to repeat the idea that I was a director in Vermont in the Goddard College. I mean, I was part of a little group, that constituted an institute, and the school required that I call myself a director of the Institute for Social Ecology. That was part of Goddard. And I never thought Goddard was, a particularly.
I want to bring this full circle because actually, believe it or not, I memorized. I just remembered your lines from the first interview about anarchism, and also bringing in this idea of morality and ethics. You said that you're an anarchist because anarchism brought ethics into socialism, as opposed to mere science.
As opposed to what?
Mere science.
Yeah.
So.
And economics. Yeah, I did. I thought so. But I told you, I read anarchism wrongly. I read Kropotkin. And Kropotkin created Kropotkin's vision of the world, and we had competing visions, shall we say. His whole attitude about the state, and I told you how I deal with the state. I'm against the state today. But I believe that the state has to be eroded, if at all possible, by a majoritarian transformation. Remember, anarchists have been more than prepared to take over power, and not even take over power, but to start a revolution without knowing what they're going to follow it up with. That's number one. You understand that some of the the head, I forgot what his name is, Mariano, the head of the CNT, was horrified by the collectivizations that were going on by the workers.
Well, that brings us into.
He was the general secretary of the CNT.
Well, that brings us into this whole issue of the glorification of the Spanish anarchist experience during the Civil War, which Spanish anarchists would have said revolution, Spanish Revolution. What's the reality check, so to speak, in brief, about your view of what went on? Was it progressive? Is it worth the idealization that so many have seized upon when they and then often you hear somebody, and I've used it myself, when you talk to a non-anarchist or somebody who questions anarchy or anarchism, and you point to, well, Spain had this successful anarchist experience.
Yeah, but the workers did it. They did it against the leadership, and the leadership participated in the outright betrayal I hate to use that word because it's so commonly used. The workers were almost consistently betrayed by their leaders. Uh, you see, I'd have to get up and get books and pull.
But you know, the interesting thing is,
Mariano, I think his name was Mariano, the General Secretary of the CNT, who at that time, during the July events, I think it was, when the workers took over Barcelona and took it over completely, lock, stock, and barrel. When the workers, with and this time forming a majority of the revolutionaries at any rate, but certainly a mass movement that a revolutionary organization had seldom seen in the history of revolutions, uh, was making a trip at that time to the Basque country. That's right. I think it was Coruña, the city of Coruña, but I'm not sure. You have to bear in mind that I have to have my raw materials in front of me. And when he heard that the workers were taking over farms, factories, and doing all of this, he screamed back, "This is a disaster. A disaster." That's what he thought of the collectives. They finally were forced to accept the collectives. And what's that woman's name again? Oh, I'm so sorry. Montseny. Ah, Montseny. Good. Now we got that down for the record. Right. Please fit it in with Montseny. When that beef called Montseny, for whom, poor Vernon this is so typical. Vernon Richards provided only one solution: you should deprive any movement of loudspeakers. You should read his book if you haven't. I don't know. His solution for all these theoretical problems was loudspeakers. You shouldn't have loudspeakers in the movement, because she was famously quite an orator and could influence a large number of people through electronic methods. That imagines, now that I think of it, I was very close friends with Vernon Richards. It makes how I allowed myself to live with that. You know what I mean? And still regard him as a political comrade.
Who's this?
Vernon Richards, the guy who wrote, because he was well-meaning. And by the way, the filthy lies that have been told about the Friends of Durruti, I met them. I met Pablo Ruiz, who was the military, head of the military committee of the Friends of Durruti. And a guy who wrote a 2-volume history of Spanish anarchism, which I spent a fortune buying in order to see what was being said. And I found out that the guy hardly knew any Spanish, but whatever he knew was grossly, how shall I say, raped. And he talked to Garcia Oliver, my pet hate. That was a character. He was on the extreme left. He was called an anarcho-Bolshevik. And he declared that this author, an American, used Garcia Oliver as a source for the claim that the Friends of Durruti, that specifically Pablo Ruiz was a waiter, and that he had nothing to do with the military, and blah, 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 things that were transparent lies. And he put it in his book. And I have no doubt that the academics will seize upon this kind of material, where I spoke to the man. He could have talked to the man himself, by the way, because he was alive at that time when this book was being prepared. This 2-volume set. And the man was filled with lies. He told the CNT lie, and that was that.
Well, it's interesting that even Emma Goldman, was forced to
lie.
Support the lies. And it's interesting that Molly Steimer, who we interviewed, was one of became one of her most vociferous critics. She criticized Emma
For doing what specifically?
for coming out in support of, basically what was then considered unanarchistic activities or policies by the Senate. I just recently read this. That she basically wrote Emma letters saying, "What are you doing? Basically, you're abandoning these principles, which I thought that you were so fiercely fighting for."
I'm not in the least surprised. She decided that Nietzsche was an anarchist. Nietzsche. No, a flat statement. Again, if I go to my files or whatever, I've been giving my files to the tenement archive.
Yeah, Steve's wife is one of the archivists there.
Now,
We
well, they're
donated
getting
our '60s
what?
stuff there. Well, we donated stuff that we had transcripts of Brand. We had tapes of Brand that he didn't want us to.
By the way, that guy's a liar too. Go ahead.
You think so?
I personally just believe that. It's an impression. I knew him in the Libertarian League.
Okay.
Oh, there's so much lying going on in that
Well,
movement.
let's just
that isn't
summarize
funny.
because I want to just sort of wrap up, but summarize like what you feel in retrospect, looking at the virtues or the downside of the so-called Spanish Revolution.
Well, there's the good side. The good side are the workers. I believe that the Spanish workers were the most revolutionary workers in history. I'll put it very bluntly. Far more Trotsky admitted that they were far more revolutionary than the Russian workers in 1917. He said that in his book, which contains horrid attacks on the anarchists, for their petty bourgeois mentality and God knows what. He frankly stated that the Barcelona proletariat was more revolutionary. The anarcho-syndicalist Barcelona syndicalist proletariat was more revolutionary than our workers in Petrograd in 1917. And that is quite a statement. Coming from the old man, as we used to call him back in the early 40s, late 30s. So my respect for the Spanish working class is immensely high. And I got to know many Spanish workers. I spent time with them. And first of all, I went to Spain, but I could only stay there for a limited amount of time because, A, I got Anarchy, and I found out that they had published an article of mine, and I knew that the Spanish police, at that time Franco was alive, and I knew that the Spanish police monitored Anarchy, what I mean, with a microscope. They were very well informed about the syndicalist movement in Spain. So that's one. And I had to go to Spain just at that time when the article had been published. So I was very prudent about what I did, but I couldn't find any anarchists in Spain anyway. And that was one. I did, however, find people who seemed to be very eager to help me. They exhibited their sympathy from what I was doing, by signs, eagerness to, find material that I was looking for that was difficult otherwise to find. And so I fell in love with that working class. That I did, and I don't regret it. To the extent, what went wrong? They got organized by a bunch of rogues.
Who were those rogues?
Well, the best thing is to go to, who's the guy who was famous, they called him Sugar Boy. Do you remember? Yeah. Read, one of the best sources of all of this was, one of the most interesting sources was Victor Serge's autobiography. He went to Barcelona and he became involved, very deeply involved, and got to know Sugar Boy. That was the nickname they gave him. Whether it was because he belonged in a worked in a sugar factory, a candy factory, or because he likes sugar, which is a very implausible explanation. I've read these different accounts of his life, and he was a very pragmatic syndicalist. And when Serge listened to his views, and he's been vastly honored in the Spanish movement, what's left of it now nothing is almost at all in existence. When he was very greatly honored, he nonetheless held views that were so markedly syndicalist that he would have been attacked as a reformist. But I don't think he was a reformist. I think he was just basically a clever, very intelligent worker who was trying to unscramble this madhouse that existed in Barcelona. Barcelona, God damn it, was a bohemian city. People don't know that. It was the most bohemian and experimental city in Spain. I mean, you had Gaudi with his architecture. You had all kinds of experiments were going on there. Free love and God knows what. The city was rife with this rich experimental vitality. And the workers, by the way, many of them did not regard themselves as Spanish, as you know. They preferred very frequently to speak in Catalan, which is a Provençal language. But that isn't the point, any point that I would want to make. Excuse me. Anywhere that I can get hold of. Oh, thank you. Hello? Hello, darling. How are you? I'm being photographed. Movies, the rest of that stuff. Yeah, I was surprised. No, come whenever you want. Everyone would like to meet you, if you don't mind. They're all here, yeah, with all kinds of lights set up. They're really professional. Movies.
That's yesterday?
Yeah. No, it doesn't let up, does it? I'm lying here, greatly relaxed and talking to very intelligent people. Yeah. Comfortable, very. I miss you intensely. Great, and we'll eat pizza, okay? No, they're not. They have to leave very shortly. Yes, if you don't mind, okay. Thank you so much, darling. I love you. Bye bye. Bye bye. Could you put that back?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know,
We still didn't
Yeah,
get a
I should have
summary of
remembered
how-
Monsanto.
yeah, we just a summary. You think?
I think I just what we didn't get you.
Look,
was we
there's a
talked-
whole coherent body of views which I can spell out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in one or two sentences,
Let's do it.
which unite.
That's it.
They unite.
But I'll tell you what.
You know, don't you think that's what we should do?
But I also what we don't have you saying.
You don't
is-
have anything about ecology, which is so
Right,
important
that's
to
right.
me.
But what we don't have you saying, because we talked about it before the camera was on, was saying that, you went back and in preparation for the last volume, studying the Spanish Revolution, and some of the things, some of these contradictions made you reevaluate your.
Well, I'll do the best I can. You see.
You are doing great, but
I want you to get a sense that this is a whole.
Yes.
Okay, that this has its own
Yeah.
quotes totality.
Right.
It's not a bunch of schemes and ideas which most people are accustomed. All right, let me start right now.
Yeah, go ahead. So,
What I'd like to convey before I close is the unity of the views that I have tried to compose, so to speak, since I saw you some 20 years ago, is it?
Yes.
Right? What I've tried to do is to ask myself, on the basis of everything that I've studied over the years and over a lifetime, nearly of 80 years, I became a pioneer in 1920, 1930. A pioneer being a communist children's organization, a member of it, a children's organization. And I've gone through almost every political ideology, and I believe quite correctly so, because I've moved with changing times, which is not being done today. On the contrary, what's being done is that the class struggle is regressing, if it could regress as much as it already has since the 40s or 50s, back to is regressing from class struggle back to religious struggles. And I look at the events today and I'm horrified. You've got to know the kind of effect it has upon me. To me, I think in terms of class struggle into nationalism, you know, uh, not just anti-capitalism against the whole bourgeois culture. And I suddenly see people arguing about the merits of Islam or Christianity. I feel I'm going back to the Crusades. You know, from the Spanish Revolution back to the Crusades is a very, very startling trip for someone of my years. As I indicated, I'm approaching 84. And most people that I used to know either have Alzheimer's disease or are dead. So you'd have to bear with the fact that my effort is a valiant one, if nothing else. But I don't want to make an appeal to the good heart of the so-called left. I say so-called very, very, very painfully, because I don't recognize much of this left anymore. But I would like to convey the unity of the views that I'm presenting here. I've accepted the truth, basic truths of Marx's theory of class struggle, of Marx's analysis of the capitalist economy. I'm one of the few people, I think, alive who's read all 3 volumes of Capital, pencil in hand, when I was in my I started when I was 16 and then kept going back again for decades. So I'd like to convey to you that based on the background that I have, which is not inconsiderable, I've tried to reconstitute ideas from Marxism, as I said, the importance of the class struggle, the structure of the capitalist economy, a good deal of its economic history, capitalism's economic history, and the need to basically, I'm not a liberal, not even a radical, I'm a revolutionary, to basically think of how to reconstruct, and let me stress this word, a rational society, for the reasons that I've already given. For me, the real question that exists now, the biggest problem, is to bring reason into history and to make sense of the social development over thousands of years. We're building a second nature over the primeval, non-human first nature that has existed for millions upon millions of years. And I've tried to get a sense of how that second nature, which we call human history, has constructed itself or been reconstructed, and the factors that have gone into changing it and the need to do so consciously. These are all the basic elements of my thinking. Viewed from that standpoint, I have tried to, as I said, not only incorporate the best of Marxism, or best of Marx's ideas, because Marxism was by no means a consistent idea, least of all does it lend itself to becoming a dogma. Marx himself, I can think of three major periods of transformation from the young Hegelian of his youth all the way up to the time shortly before his death, where he even supported the Narodnaya Volya, that is, the terrorists who Lenin invaded against, who killed Alexander II, and who believed in using violence, personal violence, against Tsarism. And his reasons for doing so and my reasons for supporting him in Russia of the 1880s are very different from what we call terrorism today. Because what we have today is really closer to murder than terrorism. Terrorism in the days of the socialist revolutionaries and the terrorists of Russia, the Narodniki, the populace, was meant to be an act of personal courage and also to shake the foundations of an Asiatic type of society, as Marx described it, where the death of one key person could really rock the foundations of all of Russian society, as we know now with Stalin. And as we know, as would know in many other countries in the third world. That I don't think is called for here in the United States by any means. I'm not inviting a tactic. I'm rather mentioning that Marxism is not a fixed and frozen dogma. What I reject in Marxism is its purely economistic point of view and the lack it really has of a morality, or what I would really call an ethics, because ethics is more than morality. Morality is custom. Ethics is reason. When you have reasoned behavior rather than behavior based on custom, you have two very marked distinctions that have to be considered. Now, what I've been concerned with is a rational society, not one based on custom, okay, which unfortunately is what anarchists have expressly said they disagree with, my point of view. They have expressly stated, in Bakunin's case, that it would be custom that would replace law. And they have expressly stated that they want people to undergo a moral transformation without giving an account of the factors that would produce that moral transformation. And I've been concerned with that, centering around my notions of post-scarcity, when it can be demonstrated that there is enough not only to go around, but even to be relatively affluent, and with a more sensible approach to save resources and so on and so forth, as certainly coalitions have demanded, but that's all they seem to have demanded. My point is that we are now at a point where capitalism is not moribund, it's not dying, it's in fact extremely robust. That must be kept in mind. We all came out of the First World War, of the interwar period, and even of the Second World War with the conviction that capitalism was moribund. George Lukács couldn't use the word capitalism without adding adjectives like dying, decaying, collapsing capitalism. Well, it isn't collapsing. Far from it. It's proven to be horribly robust and dangerously robust. And those who believe that capitalism would begin to shrink in some way or other after during the interwar period, could not undergo technological transformation. Remember, this was a fundamental idea of the socialist movement, that capitalism could not advance technology, that on the contrary it would inhibit technological growth. And it's a very fundamental tenet of Marx's historical materialism, that the symptom that a society is dying or that it's ready for revolution is its inability to change, its inability to grow. Well, it's growing too rapidly. That's the joke. The very opposite of what Marx predicted is happening today, or what Marxists predicted was happening today. All the great breakdown theories of capitalism, from Rosa Luxemburg through Lenin, through Hilferding, whatever you like, all of those classical, conventional, dogmatic images that Marxism had of capitalism has proven to be totally false. It's a growing system, and I don't know what stage it's at either. I don't know whether it's in its youth, whether it's in in its juvenility, or its adolescence, or its youth, or its adulthood. I don't know how mature it is. You tell me. I can't tell. Not after the experience of the past 80 years, where the very opposite of everything we expected has occurred. But what Marxism has contributed are the tools for an analysis. That has been invaluable. And establishing the criterion of a coherent theory, which has been the function of science, by the way, in that respect. Science marked its achievements on the degree of coherence it achieved. But it never gave up it never surrendered the idea that nature was unified, that there was a unified theory, field theory, as we know from Einstein, and other such theories, as we know, even going back further back than Newton. So, anarchism has been the contrary, first of all, of the very ideas that I felt justified and validated a revolutionary social theory, because it has argued that everything is incoherent, and that it is because the attempt to achieve it is because of the attempt to achieve coherence and causal explanations for what happens in the world today. All of these things are reactionary because they do not permit anarchy to explode. They do not permit the inner whatever, man, woman, child, who knows, to explode and unburden itself of all of its constraints and form a new society according to their wishes, whatever they may be. Please, whatever they may be. And God only knows, aside from either Marx or Kropotkin. Okay? So, the point that I want to get at is that such a theory is a non-theory and celebrates the fact that it is a non-theory. So, in trying to achieve what is a theory, a coherent whole, I've been driven to the following ideas that I regard as fundamental. First of all, that there can be an attempt, well, not even an attempt, there can be a coherent theory explicated from what we have seen since throughout the 20th century, that very key century, by the way, which humanity, if it survives, will remember for a hell of a long time. And that coherent theory would be based on the following simple facts. That there has been, and I've made this the centerpiece of the ecology of freedom, a legacy of freedom and a legacy of domination. These two chapters form the rib cage, or if you like, the two interacting spirals, somewhat, if I may use diagrammatic imagery, the interacting spirals of freedom and freedom and domination, in which dialectically the two have interacted with each other to recreate a second nature, as I said. And that in doing this, we see things that seem bad at one time, evil at one time, undesirable at one time, become good at another time. And we have to see these things interacting with each other, forming that rib cage that contains the second nature that we are building, like it or not. Secondly, I wish to emphasize that while it is true that the class struggle is a fundamental fact of life, it is not the fundamental fact of life. That the interaction between this legacy of freedom and this legacy of domination is far more encompassing, because it deals not only with the economic factors that have produced a new technology and a continually revolutionizing technology, but also the basis for a new culture and a new way of life in which want would essentially be abolished, want in the material sense, which I call post scarcity, and which is not a feature of anarchism, alas. It is, in fact, more closely, more properly, a feature of Marxism. That you need preconditions for freedom, and the horizon of freedom that you are describing is itself always undergoing change. When I was young, I have a right to speak in these terms, it was regarded as inconceivable that a person should get a divorce. I must tell you this very seriously. One of the conveniences of being a socialist was you didn't get married in the first place. But the idea that you should get a divorce. I'll never forget a time when Happy Rockefeller and John D. married, you know what I mean, by getting divorces. The world was scandalized. Or when King Edward and his paramour, who was a divorced woman, laid legitimate claims, by the way, horrible as it seems to me right now, what we know about Edward's dealings with the Nazis or his sympathy with fascism. King Edward, back in the 1930s, could not take the crown or had to abdicate because he married or wanted to marry the woman he loved, who was accursed not only by being an American, but also, just to show you how values change so rapidly in one lifetime, but by having divorced her husband. So the horizon of freedom continually changes, and it tends to expand. At least up to now, it's been expanding. It's been an expanding horizon in which this interaction between the legacy of freedom and the legacy of domination, this cage that contains the body of what we call as a whole society, itself undergoes change. As a result, I've had to face some realities. First of all, that there's no absolute, that I know of, freedom that one can finally say marks the liberation, total liberation of humanity and the end of history. There is no end to history. History is itself, first of all, a process. That's a process that is an unending process. It no more ends, for example, than I would expect species to undergo variation and change and undergo evolution. The second thing is that the horizon of freedom in expanding raises entirely new cultural values and new cultural standards and setups. But it is a coherent change. It's something that reason can comprehend. That is the one thing we have as human beings, that animals do not possess. We can have reality follow the idea. That is a remarkable fact about us, and it distinguishes us from the animal world in general. We can transform and remake reality according to the idea. That capacity exists, depending also, but let me show you that it's a complex idea, depending also, and very importantly, on the fact that preconditions have been created for new ideas and new realities to follow them exist. Therefore, I again would reject here the anarchic idea that not only is history just one big explosion of almost individual impulses, an impulsive development. I would insist that we have a coherent development, one that the thought can foresee, and which I would hope that the ideas contained in communalism, which represents the views that I hold today, that these views can predict, can assess, and can in turn design, can literally design. The question that we are faced with is how to go about doing it, and this involves an enormous departure from anarchism again. I do not believe that we can simply do it by lining up machine guns and bombs and armies revolting, mutinying the way they did in February 1917 in Russia. That world is gone. It's gone technologically, it's gone ideologically, and by the way, ironically, it's gone because the draft is being eliminated. And that's not a comfortable idea for people who are revolutionaries. At least the people retain the contact with the military, which has been more and more eliminated, more and more loosened up, more and more, shall we say, professionalized. The soldier today is not a soldier of the people. He's a bought mercenary, whether at home or abroad or wherever. He's a bought mercenary, first and foremost. So we have this enormous change that is taking place today. First, in the preconditions, in the fact that capitalism is continually revolutionizing technology. Not that it's going to bring the growth of technology to an end. On the contrary, its very mode of existence is an ongoing industrial revolution or an electronic revolution. Putting this ensemble together, one can configure what is needed today and what would be needed in the future if these ideas are correct. First of all, as I pointed out, the state is a, how shall I say, mutating phenomenon. I've opposed its existence, that is to say, as a professionalized set of institutions that are designed to oppress the working masses, to use classical language. I oppose the state because it has to be abolished in order to achieve freedom. And we have to find out what we mean by freedom. We have to find out what are the elements that enter into our definition of freedom, and what are the ways in which we are going to achieve the ends that we seek in the name of freedom, an ever-changing definition in itself. And what are we faced with? First, we have to get rid of some notions which are uniquely anarchist, and that is the notion that humanity, excuse me, gentlemen, I'm drying out. Come on in, please. My companion, Janet Beale.
Okay if I make noise.
These are the folks from
Hello.
the
Hi.
Let me see if I got it straight now. The Pacific
Pacific.
that, yeah. Because I continually confuse them with Atlantic and Arctic and Antarctic. Janet Beale, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Steve.
Hi, Steve.
I'm Joe.
Hi, Joe.
I'm Katsumi.
Hi, Katsumi. I'm Janet. Hi. Do I have to be quiet?
Just
We're
let me.
just
I'm
finishing
wrapping
right
things
now
up.
for the whole shoot. So
I'm wrapping things up.
Okay. So that means I only have to be quiet for a little while.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's
I can just get through here.
is that stuff in the way? Or you?
Oh, no problem.
Since freedom is an open question, the first issue of how to get to it is always ambiguous. It's always ambiguous and depends upon time and place. Because one doesn't know what one wants to achieve in the name of freedom. But significantly, history provides some directive, some point, some converging points that make it possible to speak of the coming century, let us say. And that would be the following, these converging points. One, the state will not be eliminated simply in simply by violence or simply by insurrection. The state will only properly be eliminated, rationally eliminated, by an alternative in society based on institutions that are rational, that will maximize democracy and the rationality of the broad mass of people. It cannot be the next revolution, call it what you will, with whatever means it uses, must be a majoritarian revolution. This is not an idea that is clearly articulated by a unified anarchist theory. That question is not taken up. What is taken up is what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And that is what would justify even a minoritarian revolution. That possibility occurred, frankly, in Spain in 1936, when a minority of the country tried to establish what was called libertarian communism. It was a very large minority, but it was still decidedly a minority. If there's anything that a majority of the Spanish people wanted, it was a democratic republic. There's no point in kidding ourselves about that. Reality tells us, other than what we usually get from anarchist textbooks on the Spanish Revolution, namely that the great majority of the Spanish working class, which was always a minority in the country to begin with, absurd of all things, wanted libertarian communism. Libertarian communism may have been more rational than any other social order that was suggested, but it is not true that this was a conviction of the majority of the Spanish people. So the question of the wisdom of a revolution in Spain is something that had to be attuned to the real possibilities that existed, and it was not attuned. It was not attuned. Franco had not even made up his mind until well into 1936 that he was prepared to take over the leadership of Spain. The generals and their plots and everything that was going on were all done as military conspiracies rather than social movements. That Franco, using fascism, turned what was a military conspiracy later on into a social movement, which he claimed to have in the name of the Falange, but mainly controlled by the military, was a relatively late development, only a few months away from the actual outbreak of the revolution itself. That's number one. Number two, the working class of Spain, the most heroic and remarkable working class that I know of in history, was a minority. So a majoritarian revolutionary movement, if it's going to be revolutionary in the true sense of producing social change, has to be a majoritarian movement composed of the great majority of the people, and there have to be institutions that not only represent the future change that people are trying to achieve, that the majority of the people are trying to achieve. It also has to be the means for achieving that revolution, actually making it, and in a way that is rational, sensible, and is satisfying to the people as a whole. Now, the way I can envision such a change anywhere in the world today would have to be one that involves the people. And you don't involve the people simply with slogans. On the contrary, you're likely to produce a disaster based merely on slogans. You have to involve them in a means that is not congenial to anarchism, and I would say not congenial even to many socialists. In fact, I doubt if the socialists would disagree with the anarchists on what I'm about to propose. And that is to create what I would call a dual power. That is to say, an attempt on a neighborhood basis on a civic basis, in the sense that I'm talking of quasi or actual urban areas, where people can get together into assemblies on the basis of a number of broad social issues, a point that would have to be raised in a moment. Broad social issues meeting the way, well, in a sense, resembling the way the town meetings of New England ideally existed, and in fact actually existed for a time. I'm not even talking right now of purely hypothetical notions. I'm talking right now of actual things that took form in history, that took shape in history, and that have been on and off discussed, but not as fully as they should be. In such town meetings, one would try to have paralleling what are the institutions of the state, or at least the basic institutions of the state, real institutions, libertarian institutions of the people, at first seemingly coexisting with the state, but gradually, by the very nature of the problems that would arise, the populist problems that would arise, would gradually enter into a conflict with the state. And there would have to be a real question of who will ultimately have the power. Now, I believe in power. On this point, I decidedly would agree with Marx. My belief in power is a total commitment, because when we are talking about society, we are talking about real hard facts that involve everything from transportation of food, clothing, and the manufacture thereof, over to questions of what kind of policy should be followed as a matter of so-called foreign policy, as a matter of so-called public welfare, as a matter of designing cities, as a matter of dealing with the natural world, which is a very important factor. And it is through the erosion, institution by institution, of the existing state and its institutions by civic institutions, town meetings, that through the conflict you would gradually have a resolution of the problem of who shall have the power. I favor the power of the people, so to speak. And for once, the cry, power to the people, has concrete meaning, institutional meaning. I do not agree with the anarchists on the score that institutions are in themselves constraints that have to be avoided in any shape or form under any conditions. So in creating a dual power, you're creating a separate society that stands in conflict with the existing society, but does so depending upon the legitimacy it achieves among the broad masses of people. Now, this flows out of a whole dialectic in which one, law is gradually rendered rational rather than irrational, which it is today, and it is a demand that the people have made for thousands of years. One can go back to the writings of Hesiod on Works and Days, where Hesiod says that we need laws to control the barons. This is the translation I've gotten from the Greek version of his so-called poem. There, what he says, in effect, is that law or regulation is necessary to eliminate arbitrary rule. And the real problem that the masses faced at that time, or at least one of the major problems that the masses faced at that distant time and throughout the course of history, was to eliminate arbitrary power. And that arbitrary power, to a great extent, is one of the features of anarchism today, because behavior is to be guided by individual volition. The individual is the center of anarchist theory and anarchist procedure, social procedures. Law is to be despised because it mutes the individual, it silences the individual, it denies the individual. And one will find this precisely in the writings of people like I keep going back to his real name, Schmidt, help me fellas, Stirner. One will find this in Max Stirner, where the center of social life starts from the individual and goes outward, rather than the basis of social life being consociation, community itself devolving, shaping, or structuring is precisely the word that I want to use, structuring the disposition of power in the social world. That's one fundamental break, again, with the anarchists. A second fundamental break with the anarchists is regulation and constitution. Constitution must be formulated clearly as a basis for the structure, political structure of society, just as the so-called American Constitution, the American so-called Constitution, but other more radical constitutions existed to indicate, to establish the framework of what constituted the body politic. A second thing is that it is from this power, again note well that I'm speaking of power which is rejected by anarchism, flowing from the bottom up, and up means less and less power the higher you get. You have confederal ties in which ultimately the result of a confederal meeting or a confederal discourse and formulation of ideas go downward to the masses largely as suggestions, but also to the extent that these suggestions have to be practicable and to have more meaning than just suggestions or forms of advice. They have to have a coherence and a unity which challenges the ability of society to work communally, work together in a very distinct, organized form. The basis of society, the structure of society, therefore, is from the town meeting through the local town meetings, groups of town meetings, and higher until you get into regions in which an attempt is made to create a confederal type of society. That confederation replaces the state, just as the nation stands in opposition to the confederation, so the confederation, one would envision, replaces the state. And very importantly, or more significantly, the arena of society is spatial, in the sense that I would call this communalism, because it is community itself, a community itself, both locally and ultimately on a higher and higher level of interaction that presents, deals with laws, explores them, and tries to formulate a rational resolution of problems that confront the society. Communalism,
Well, our tape is out. Is it out?
having spoken about law, institutions, constitution in the form of confederation, I would like to take the subject broad to another level by discussing the issues that are likely, in my opinion, to provoke a change in American society and in the world as a whole, I would hope. We need issues that are larger, important as they are. Please let me stress that. The immense importance of what I wish to mention, the economic question must be resolved. Property must be resolved communistically. Uh, uh, the appropriate distribution of resources must be resolved. All of this must be resolved communistically, and I would add rationally. But what I'm also suggesting in mentioning these things is that a great many issues that were most pronounced in the previous century, the 20th century, issues of economics, issues of exploitation, all very important to this day, but at one time almost the only important real issues that were meant to mobilize people, namely the working class, would not only exist but would be amplified by a rich panoply of other issues that are cultural, that are psychological, that are even artistic, having to do with the design of cities or communities, having to do with logistics, having to do with new technologies, which, by the way, whose flow is virtually endless, would be incorporated into a political program. And I use the word politics, again, let me stress, as direct democracy, which is what it meant, at least in Hellenic times, where the word essentially was essentially invented. What I'm suggesting is that we must speak of a much broader program than the program that was envisioned by Marx, who felt that it was not even necessary to provide one, a broader one, than his economic programs, because he said he couldn't foresee what the future would bring, which is a good cop-out, certainly for today. Today we are confronting issues of immense social and biological, ecological, to put it bluntly, social ecological issues that go beyond economics alone. In fact, the attempt would be made more and more to make economics a moral, what word should I use? A moral tenet or aspect, more precisely, a moral aspect, which is what economics properly should be. The attempt on the part of a society that I'm describing is not only one in which you have the satisfaction of human needs in a rational way, such that we diminish the amount of work that people have to do, such that we enlarge the amount of free time that allows people to participate. You have to have those practical means to actually participate in a society that would be called rational by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm talking about is, frankly, the substitution of an entirely new culture from the one that for the one that we have today. First of all, and primary in my view, is that capitalism is a growing social order. Contrary to what Marx believed and what many anarchists believed, capitalism is not marked by attrition, is not marked by a economic regression, is not marked by economic decline. One of the greatest dangers it poses today is that it is marked by unfettered growth. The growth of the system poses a tremendous problem for humanity at large, and indeed for the future of what I would call second nature, that is to say, for society. the alteration of the natural world in such a way that we continually simplify it for mass manufacturing purposes. That outlook of mass manufacture, simplification, turning soil into sand, turning forests into mere denizens, mere agglomerations, conurbations of brick and whatever we use today or will use tomorrow in the manufacture of shelter and of housing in any form is the real problem that we face. The ecological issue is not simply a question of preserving wildlife. It's not simply a question. It's not only a question of pure water, clean air, and so forth. It is first and foremost a question of the simplification of the planet for the purposes of an industrial society of unlimited growth, which threatens the very bases for human life as well as animal life on this planet. We are simplifying the planet, ecologically speaking. We are turning it into a resource or a bundle of resources for ever more, what word shall I use here? Ever more structural, ever more materials for structural design, for cities, the production of cities, roadways, God knows what, and mass manufacture of food in almost every shape and form, but always in an ever more unnatural form. In other words, we're turning back the geological clock. Capitalism, far from threatening the existence of second nature as a regressive society, one that threatens to produce a more primitive type, a more primal type of natural world, now threatens to also produce a world in which advanced life forms can't exist in a satisfactory manner, not even in a question, not even as a question of sanitation, but of health, but of giving to our future generations a world that enjoys the spontaneity of nature and natural evolution, one that is a designed world so completely that human beings have now restructured the world so that they can't even live in it. So that the ecological question raises the broader question, the broader issue of whether or not life can be sustained on this planet without undergoing changes in techniques and technology and in scientific knowledge that make human life, make it habitable, make the planet itself habitable. And this goes along the whole range of human experience and human lifeways. What kind of world we are creating is more than rhetorical. It is a question of whether or not it is even practicable, whether or not it is a domain that can sustain life itself in the planet. So what we need is a movement, which I've called communalist because it's based on the formation of the community, its innate structural forms like town meetings, its freedom of time and ability to sustain a viable society. I would say that this is basically what communalism, in its most fundamental sense, adds up to. There's so much more that one can add on to it about human life ways, about relationship, almost geological relationships, so vast is it in character, of humanity to the natural world. So that the natural world has now entered once again, as it had existed from the very beginning, way back in time, has re entered society, has re entered every aspect of human life as to make it even feasible to speak not only of a rational society, but of an ecological society, a word that I invented and use continually. We must develop a new relationship with First Nature. Second Nature must develop a new relationship with First Nature so that a third nature, so to speak, to give you the good old dialectical triad, a third nature will emerge in which there will be a sensitive balance between the organic and the inorganic, between a livable planet and one that lends itself to a remaking for industrial purposes and economic purposes, and ultimately a post-scarcity society. This essentially is what I've more or less driven my views to.
Hey, we did it again. 24 years later, I think.
Let's get some room tone.
That'll be up to you, won't
Well,
it?
the one thing is we just got to get some room tone, which is just the silence, the ambience of the room. Okay? Room tone,